We have some breaking news now from the BBC. New social media rules for Flagship presenters after the Gary Lineker row. This is new guidance from the BBC. It goes on to say it recognises the importance of freedom of expression, but says that whilst a programme is on air and for a 2-week window before and after the series, presenters on Flagship shows must not endorse or attack a political party. Well, joining me now is Professor Tim Luckhurst, Principal of South College at Durham University, also a former BBC executive. A very good morning to you.
Good morning.
I'm really delighted by this. It's not before time, is it?
Well, it's a sensible tidying up of rules which have been very ambiguous about whether presenters who are not working as journalists or current affairs programme front people were bound by the same rules as those that apply to BBC journalists. Now, I think that we'll see whether this really works in practice as incidents arise and complaints are made, but it's certainly a step in the right direction. It is an answer to Gary Lineker's insistence that he was allowed to say what he said. It's the BBC saying, no, if you're a BBC presenter on a high-profile programme, whether it's sport, whether it's an antiques show or a current affairs show, you do have an obligation to the BBC's commitment to impartiality. And yeah, I think that's very valuable.
So you say it's a tidying up exercise. I can see great holes in it already, though. Let's take Gary Lineker. If he's doing Match of the Day, let's say, I don't know how long it runs for, let's say 10 weeks, a 10-week run. So I assume he can't then attack political parties in that 10-week run, but also for 2 weeks before, so that's 12 weeks, 14 weeks. After those 14 weeks, he can then mouth off about certain political parties.
Well, I think that I share your concern that there is perhaps a little bit too much nuance and technicality about this. I would prefer a simple guideline which insisted that any high-profile presenter working for the BBC should maintain in all circumstances the impartiality that is expected of BBC journalists. I think that rules work best when they're simple, and that there are here potential gaps which will allow people to squeeze through and establish a reputation for taking a particular political stance on something which will become associated with them even when they're on the BBC. As I say, we'll see how it works in practice, but I prefer something much simpler.
Well, so would I, actually. And just in terms of that, what is a high-profile presenter? How do you categorise them?
I think that if somebody is recognised, even by a specialist following, as being the BBC's voice on a particular topic, and that needn't be something as high profile as Premier League football, it can be somebody who's presenting a specialist show on, for example, cookery or antiques, many other shows. If their reputation and their fame depends on their presence on a BBC programme, then they should be bound by BBC guidelines. I say all of this as a proud member of the Free Speech Union. I think that there's nothing more important than freedom of speech. But in order to promote freedom of speech, the BBC as an institution has to demonstrate that it's genuinely impartial. If it doesn't do that, then people from one or other side of political arguments will not feel comfortable appearing as guests on the BBC. So I think it is compatible with freedom of speech to say, if you accept a contract with the BBC or work for the BBC in a role that gives you a real national profile, you should recognise that that comes with the duty of impartiality.
So does that mean for the people who have a contract with the BBC, because many presenters obviously are freelance, they work through independent production companies, so that would apply to them too?
Yes, I think it absolutely has to, because this has always been something which has been, I think, a slight vulnerability, if you like, an Achilles heel for the BBC. It insists that people aren't actually employees, but in fact, the thing that makes them famous is the BBC programme that they're contracted to present. And that can apply even in news programmes. I mean, in the past, when I was an editor on the Today programme at BBC Radio 5 Live, we had presenters who were BBC the voice of the BBC, who were very high profile on the BBC, but also did other work as ostensibly freelance journalists. But they had to acknowledge that it was the BBC programme that really gave them the profile. And in that sense, I thought it was important they were treated as employees. And I think that applies to anybody like Gary Lineker or any other high profile presenter who is essentially on a contract with the BBC, may do other work, but is gains their profile very largely from working for the BBC.
So can I just ask you, where did it all go wrong? I joined the BBC back in, I think, 97 or thereabouts. We would never have been allowed to express personal opinion when I was at the BBC, and I was there for some considerable years. Firstly on a children's news programme, then I moved into consumer programming as well. It wouldn't have crossed my mind to vent my thoughts about anything. But is that also because social media wasn't there to the same degree?
The BBC has always had a commitment to impartiality, and it has always had problems in demonstrating precisely what that impartiality means. But it is known and loved around the world because it is regarded as a trustworthy broadcaster and indeed one of Britain's greatest exports, the greatest examples of cultural diplomacy in the world, in fact. So, yeah, the BBC has always had to deal with the new circumstances which arise, and social media has created a problem for every kind of conventional media. The conventional media work to standards of accuracy, truth and evidence, which simply don't apply on social media. The conventional media are responsible for what they publish because they are treated as publishers, whereas, in my opinion, people like Twitter, X as it now calls itself, and other social media sites have got away with murder by claiming that they are not publishers. In my opinion, they should be treated as publishers. Those that are treated as publishers have problems with social media precisely because social media denies responsibility for what it publishes. I think that is an inequitable situation and one which governments should seek to tidy up. Of course, it's very difficult because you'd have to do it internationally and it's almost impossible to get agreement, but it is an anomaly which is going to cause problems as long as it endures.
How much of this is good governance and how much of this is the BBC desperately trying to cling on to the licence fee?
I don't think the licence fee is in any serious sense threatened. There are challenges to the way that it's structured, challenges to the way in which individual groups in the population pay and whether they should all pay the same amount. But I think there is broad political consensus that the BBC is a very valuable national asset and that the universal principle in paying for it is accepted. That's not really in dispute. So at the moment, what the BBC is doing is trying, as it always does, to confront and deal sensibly with a new problem which has arisen, as you rightly suggest, in the era of social media. I think it's attempting to do exactly what it needs to do, but I still fear that the rules may prove a little bit too complex. They may need to be simplified in the near future. But a good start, and therefore good governance at the BBC.
A good start, but shouldn't they have done this 10 years ago?
Well, they weren't clear that they had a problem 10 years ago, and large organisations do tend to think slowly and carefully before making substantial changes. You can criticise them for that, but largely I think the BBC gets these things right and does so in the interests of its licence payers. So, yeah, perhaps it would have been a good idea. I, after all, suggested at the time that what Gary Lineker was claiming shouldn't have been acceptable under BBC rules, and I'll stand by that description. But I'm glad the BBC's done this now, and I look forward to seeing how it works in practice.
And just very quickly, how will people like Gary Lineker react to this, do you think?
Well, I think you'd better ask Gary Lineker that. On the whole, Gary Lineker has views. I think that Gary Lineker should probably keep those views quiet. As a football presenter and an expert in the game, he is beyond compare. I love listening to him and watching him. His expertise is quite superb and very clearly recognised by his viewers. But I'm not interested in what he thinks about politics any more than I think he should be interested in my capacity to play football, which, by the way, I can't do very well.
Neither can I. Neither can I. Really good to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed, Tim. That's Professor Tim Luckhurst, Principal of South College, Durham University, and former BBC executive.